for joining us today. My name is Jully Meriño, and I am a program coordinator here at the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia University. Tonight we're going to be talking about energy, financial markets, and geopolitics with a set of distinguished experts. I will be introducing the moderator in a moment, but first let me quickly say that this event, as all of our center events, is being live streamed. And the full video and the podcast recording will be available on our website and on iTunes in the coming days. And for those of you watching online, as well as those sitting here in the audience, you can ask questions for the panelists at any time by using the hashtag CGEP at our Twitter handle at Columbia U Energy. So first I want to introduce our moderator for this evening. It's Carolyn Kissane. She serves as a clinical associate professor and academic director at the Center for Global Affairs at New York University, where she teaches graduate level courses that examine the Central Asian region, the geopolitics of oil, comparative energy politics, resource security, and global civil society. She serves as the coordinator of the Energy and Environment Concentration at the Center and is a faculty advisor to the Energy Policy International Club. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's really a great pleasure to be here this evening, and I am just so thrilled to be here with three such distinct panelists. I'd also like to extend my very warm thanks to the Center on Global Energy Policy. This is the first time I'm on this side of the table. I'm usually in the audience, but it's been really thrilling to watch the development of the center and to really see New York become an important thought leader on energy policy and environmental discussions that happen here at the center. And also, I'd like to extend a very special thank you to a woman who's not here, but was really pivotal in bringing the Women in Energy program here to Columbia, Kay Way. Kay Way approached me in the fall of 2014 to discuss a grant that she was putting together, which she received, and the Women in Energy program is really doing some amazing programs, and now it's under the leadership of Jully Meriño, and it's really exciting to have something like this here in New York. So many thanks for your leadership on this very important initiative. So now I'd like to go ahead and introduce our panelists. To my immediate left, the Honorable Sharon E. Burke. She is a senior advisor to New America, where she focuses on international security and a new program, Resource Security, which examines the intersection of security, prosperity, and natural resources. Before joining New America, Ms. Burke served in the Obama administration as the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Operational Energy, a new office that worked to improve the energy security of U.S. military operations. Prior to her service at the DoD, Ms. Burke held a number of senior U.S. government positions, including the Department of State in the George W. Bush administration, and was a vice president and senior fellow at the Center for New American Security. She attended Williams College and Columbia University, where she was a Zuckerman and International Fellow at the School of International and Public Affairs. She also serves as an advisor to Oak Ridge National Laboratory, the World Economic Forum's Global Agenda Council on Decarbonizing Energy, and the Pew Project on National Security, Energy, and Climate. Thank you, Sharon. Robin Dunnigan is a career member of the U.S. Foreign Service, currently serving as the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Energy Diplomacy in the Department of State's Bureau of Energy Resources. Ms. Dunnigan oversees the Bureau's Office of Middle East and Asia and the Office of Europe, the Western Hemisphere, and Africa. During her 22-year career in the Foreign Service, Ms. Dunnigan has served overseas in Vietnam, Chile, Turkey, Cuba, and El Salvador. In Washington, she worked in the Bureau of Near Eastern Affairs and on the staff of the Secretary of State in the 24-Hour Operations Center. Ms. Dunnigan is a distinguished graduate of the National War College, where she earned a Master of Science in National Security Strategy. She also received a Master of Science in Foreign Service from Georgetown University and a Bachelor of Science in Business Administration from the University of California at Berkeley. She is multilingual, speaking Spanish, Turkish, and Vietnamese. Helima Croft. Helima is Managing Director, Global Head of Commodity Strategy and Global Research at RBC Capital Markets. She joined RBC from Barclays, where she was a Managing Director and Head of North American Commodities Research, specializing in geopolitics and energy. Halima's team was responsible for the firm's research covering oil, natural gas, base and precious metals, as well as the economics and politics of key commodity-producing countries in the Middle East, Africa, and Latin America. Prior to that, she worked in Lehman's Business Intelligence Group. Early in her career, Helima held positions at the Council on Foreign Relations and the CIA, where she focused on geopolitics and commodities. And as of September 2015, Helima became an exclusive CNBC contributor, joining the ranks of the TV channel's exclusive guests. Helima has received many industry accolades throughout her career, including Breaking Energy's top 10 New York women in energy. She is also a life member of the Council on Foreign Relations and received her PhD in economic history from Princeton in 2001. So clearly, the wealth of expertise here on the panel is extraordinary for the topics that we're going to be discussing this evening: energy, financial markets, and geopolitics. Again, for those watching online and listening to the podcast, my name is Carolyn Kissane, and we're going to open up the panel. I've asked each of our three panelists to start with some opening comments, and then I will jump in and ask questions. And then we'll be opening up to the audience, as well as to those who may tweet in questions from around the world. So I'm going to hand the floor over to Sharon.
Thank you, Carolyn. Thank you very much for moderating the panel, for bringing your expertise, and to Jully for putting this together. It's great to be here back at SIPA, and particularly for the Global Energy Center. So I'm delighted to join this conversation. And we have a great panel. I think we're all very complementary. So how I look at the topic that we're here to discuss is very much through a national security lens and really a military lens. So that's very different. And even how I look at financial markets is very different from, I suspect, the way certainly Helima looks at it. So this will be an interesting conversation. Just to give a couple of opening comments. I think, when we have a low oil price environment like we do right now, you tend to get energy complacency. And it comes and goes. And right now, the idea that we have an energy security challenge as a nation is probably at a low ebb. And in a public sense, people don't really see it. But of course, it's always there. And as a national security, as a defense person, I'm always thinking about the link not only between energy and geopolitics and how it shapes the security environment, as a source of funds that tends to go straight to governments, as a source of geopolitical leverage, as a source of friction at a communal level, but also between states and globally. But I also look at it as a military challenge. I'll tell a little bit more about that. And I think it's very important when you look at energy as a security issue that you don't decouple it from climate change, because otherwise you're going to come up with artificial solutions. You have to look at both of those in the long term and be pragmatic about both, in my opinion, and we can talk more about that. As a military challenge, we tend to look at it as strategic, operational, and tactical. So meaning the way that energy shapes the strategic landscape between nations and the geopolitics between nations, but also at an operational level. So for example, right now, US forces are operating in Afghanistan. Energy shapes that theater, as we would call it, but it also shapes our ability to be there. So at a tactical level, we go through a lot of fuel. At one point, it was about 50 million gallons a month, and that fuel has to come from somewhere and come through somewhere. So it was coming from the Gulf through Pakistan until those supply lanes were shut down, and then it was coming from Russia through all of Central Asia. So you can see that that might not be just a tactical challenge. If you're getting your fuel that your military operation depends on from Russia, and it has to go through all of Central Asia, it's going to have strategic second-order effects. So those were things that we thought about a great deal. When I say you can't decouple climate change and energy security, I'll give a very specific example. That in the 2008 timeframe, when fuel prices really ran up, that's a very big bill for the Department of Defense. They spend between $14 and $20 billion a year on fuel. And so there was a lot of interest in figuring out how to diversify. And the Air Force wanted to put a lot of money into coal to liquid and building coal to liquid plants. You know, looking to coal, there's a lot of reasons why that might be problematic, and DoD is just going to buy it in the commercial markets, generally speaking. So if you don't consider that coal to liquid comes with its own second order effects, you're going to have an artificial choice. So how does DoD look at climate change as a security issue? You have a fine line sometimes between militarizing and securitizing an issue. Climate change is not a military issue. You can't tell military units to go out and attack climate change and conquer it, but it does affect military missions. So humanitarian and disaster relief missions are a core mission for the Department of Defense. Those missions are increasing in frequency and severity, including here at home. Sandy, for example, some 40,000 defense personnel responded to that. So they have to consider how it's affecting those missions. They also refer to climate change as a conflict accelerator. So it doesn't cause conflict, but where you have weak governments, if you suddenly have drought conditions and famine, and people start to move, and there's underlying conflict, it can tip over into a conflict situation. And again, military organizations need to understand what that looks like. And of course, DoD is a very large landholder as well, has 28 million acres around the world, and a lot of it is littoral. So they do think about how they need to adapt their own property. And I think that's the basic. I think the last thing I'll say is just when we look at energy security writ large for the United States, both at home and as a geopolitical force, I think people often look at DoD and think that DoD is going to be a catalyst, a technology catalyst, because it's not an unreasonable thing to think. I mean, DoD was the catalyst for the internet and for GPS and for many things that have changed the way we live and our civil society. But I think that when it comes to energy, again, DoD is going to look at it as how does it affect the security environment, how does it affect our ability to operate, and how does it affect our tactics, our ability to have tactics. And there's some innovation going on there, certainly with solar at remote positions, things like that. But in general, DoD is going to innovate for its own needs, and at some point that spills over into the civil society. But I would say looking to them as a trusted institution that's solving its own problems is a legitimate thing to do. Looking at them to solve everyone else's problems, probably not so much. And that does happen sometimes. So that's just in general how I look at these issues, and I think we'll get more into other aspects of it as we go.
Sharon, thank you so very much. Appreciate it. Robbie?
Thanks. And thank you to Carolyn and to Jully for organizing this and for inviting me, and Helima and Sharon. I am thrilled to be on a Women in Energy panel with women, because I was saying when I came in that 3 years ago I was at an annual oil and gas conference in Houston, and they had a Women in Oil and Gas panel, and 2 of the 3 panelists were men. And I thought, really, you can't come up with 3 women in the entire oil and gas industry? So it's nice that you guys could drum up 3 of us.
Well, thank you.
Carolyn asked me to start with a few words on the geopolitics of the natural gas in Europe, which is a perfect example for me to start with, I think, because that example is really about the intersection between national security, foreign policy, and energy issues. Sharon mentioned that the driver between national security and energy is, that it's a critical intersection, and it's that intersection that actually formed the birth of the bureau I work in the State Department. So we're the only foreign ministry in the world, the U.S. State Department is, that has an entire bureau dedicated to energy issues. And it was started about 5 years ago, really out of recognition that energy issues are critical to our economic growth and economic growth of our partners overseas and our allies. It's critical to our climate goals and to others' climate goals, and it's critical to political stability around the world. So Hillary Clinton was a new Secretary of State in January of 2009. Her first trip, overseas trip, was to Asia, but her second trip was to Europe. Now, I don't know if you can back up to 2009, but it was in January of 2009 that Russia cut off natural gas exports to Ukraine for the second time. And at that time, Ukraine actually stopped transiting natural gas down to its customers downstream in Europe, to Slovakia, Hungary, Poland, and others. So in 2009, you had, in the middle of a very cold winter, you had European households without natural gas. They were, freezing. People were actually moving out of their homes. In 2009, And what Hillary Clinton heard from some of her interlocutors is, Russia brought us to our knees in 10 days. And that is a huge national security risk for us. And a national security risk for Europe, for our NATO allies, is a national security risk for the United States. So that influenced Hillary Clinton when she created the Bureau of Energy Resources, that intersection between national security and energy issues. So what happened after 2009? Well, Europe started to get its act together and started to do things. They implemented something called the Third Energy Package. They started looking at integrating their energy markets and their regulatory policies. And things started to improve. However, not enough, because in 2014, you have Ukraine right downstream from Russia, 100% dependent on Russia for its natural gas imports. So it's not the only, that dependency or vulnerability isn't the only driver of the Russia-Ukraine crisis, but it certainly influenced it. It certainly gave Russia leverage over Ukraine and emboldened, in some sense, Russia to annex Crimea in 2014. So our energy policy, or our foreign policy in Europe today, has a large component around energy issues, working with our European partners to diversify away from Russian gas. And that doesn't mean that Russian gas won't continue to be an important commodity to European markets. It will. And Russia should be supplying Europe. It's right next door. It's a huge gas producer, and the gas pipeline infrastructure flows down to Europe. But it shouldn't be the only supplier for any country. And there are 6 countries, 5 or 6 now, that are 100% dependent on Russia still. And there are another 5 or 6 that are more than 60% dependent on Russia for their natural gas. And so it's been and we've actually made some progress. And I just want to make one note about our progress with Ukraine. When that crisis happened, Ukraine, like I said, got 100% of its imports from Russia. And I was sitting around a table of national security professionals in Washington, and I said that our goal was going to be that within 5 years, Ukraine could get through a winter without Russian gas. And I literally was scoffed at, laughed at, saying there's no way Ukraine's gonna make it through a winter without Russian gas. Well, this winter, Ukraine imported about 20 BCM, billion cubic meters of gas, and more of it was from Europe than from Russia. Huge change in just 2 years. In fact, they could have gone through the winter without Russian gas. They chose to buy it, they didn't have to. How did we do that? We worked with the downstream countries, Slovakia, Hungary, and Poland, to ensure that the pipelines that were there, gas could flow both ways, reverse flow of gas. And those countries did it. It was a big diplomatic push, and it required sustained high-level attention from senior government officials, but it worked. And this winter, Ukraine actually got through the winter. So I think that natural gas politics in Europe, there are few areas where you can see that intersection more than there. And then Carolyn also asked me to talk a little bit about the low price environment and some political vulnerabilities around the world. I think, as Sharon so rightly said, when you're sitting where we're sitting with 9 million barrels a day of oil production, we added 3 million barrels over the last 5 or 6 years, and I'm sure Helima is going to talk more about this. When you look at what has happened here on natural gas because of the shale gas revolution, it's phenomenal. It's transformational what's happened in natural gas here. It was estimated that by now we would be importing anywhere from 50 to 60% of our natural gas needs. We're exporting LNG today. We just started last month, and we will put onto the market about 100 billion cubic meters of liquefied natural gas over the next decade. Really an incredible transformation. So people always think, well, that means the United States is energy independent now. Independence, yes. You got it. Not at all. I mean, oil is still a global commodity, and gas is increasingly more like oil because of the convergence of regional gas prices. So a disruption in one part of the world has price impacts on the United States, it has economic impacts, but also political instability around the world has a huge impact on the United States. So just a few very quick areas of concern that we're looking at today. We have 2 countries, Iraq and Nigeria, that are fighting terrorist organizations. In Iraq, obviously, ISIL. In Nigeria, Boko Haram. Their ability to fight those terrorist organizations certainly is hurt when their oil revenues are down by 40, 50%, and that's where those countries' government revenues are today. Beyond Nigeria, let's look at Venezuela. Venezuela is probably hurt, I think, and maybe you'll talk more about this, more than any other country by the drop in oil prices. It's on the verge of economic collapse. It's not providing health services, electricity, food, or transportation to its citizens. It's likely to default on its debt, according to many analysts. And it has a spillover effect because Venezuela has propped up many Caribbean countries and Central American countries with oil, with subsidies basically for oil purchases through the Petrocaribe program. So Venezuela's in tough times, and even countries that we think are looking good, like Saudi Arabia. You know, Saudi Arabia has had over $750 billion in reserves, so people thought, well, that's all right, Saudi Arabia's gonna make it through. But Saudi Arabia also has a young generation that's looking for jobs. It does not have a diversified economy. It's fighting a war in Yemen. It has important donor responsibilities like supporting Syrian refugees in Jordan. And its reserves are down by, I think, 150 billion today. So Saudi Arabia, it's tough times, and they're not on the verge of collapse, but it's certainly a challenge to get through this market. The good news is I think that low oil price environments also give countries a wake-up call, producers, to reform, diversify their economies, implement fossil fuel subsidy reform where necessary, and some of that is starting to happen, and that's a good thing. I can talk a little bit more, I think, about, if we're interested in later in the Q&A, talking about energy policy as another tool in our foreign policy toolkit. Iran oil sanctions are what brought Iran to the table, and I'm happy to talk about that. And we now have energy sanctions on Russia. I could talk more about that too. So maybe I'll stop there and leave more time for Q's and A's.
Yeah. Excellent. Thank you so very much, Robin. Lots of great material to work from here. Thank you.
Yeah, so I'll be brief because I love the topics you were mentioning so much. I can't wait to dive into the discussion. But just as a little bit of a perspective, like my entire career since leaving Princeton has sort of been in the realm of geopolitics and energy. I left Princeton after doing a PhD, joined the CIA after 9/11. I was the economic analyst covering West and Central Africa. There were like 5 of us for like 36 countries. And you could say, like, who makes a career covering West Africa right after 9/11? It's not really a hot spot to make a career. You want to be working in the Middle East. But at that time, the focus of the administration was so much on finding non-Middle Eastern sources of oil, engaging with those countries. And so actually covering Nigeria and Angola was actually a path to quite a good career in the US government. And what is so different, looking at it now versus, what it was like after 9/11, was if there was a supply disruption anywhere, the administration took it very seriously. And I remember my worst moment as an analyst was when there was a coup in Sao Tome, and I got a call at like 3 o'clock in the morning being asked by one of Cheney's briefers, what happened in Sao Tome? And I was like, I don't even know where it is on a map. I was told, wrong question, get into work. And we were so concerned because they weren't drilling for anything yet in Sao Tome, but Exxon had signed this agreement to develop the joint development zone between Sao Tome and Nigeria, and it was seen as a potential new source of supply. I mean, this big Gulf of Guinea initiative. Nigeria was a central focus. It was supposed to go from producing about 2.3 million barrels a day to 4 million by 2010. It was supposed to be an important partner in diversifying our sources of supply. And then I think back to being on this task force that the Council on Foreign Relations did in 2006 on energy and national security. And I was sort of the junior member of that task force. They were looking for somebody young, a woman, to sort of bring down the age and bring the women to the table. I think I was one of like 3 people on that task force. I was not an older white male. But what was so interesting was when I look at the findings of that task force, and it talked about we don't think we can ever drill our way out of dependence on foreign oil. Basically, the fool's errand. We need to think about managing our dependence on these suppliers. So what type of pressure should we really put on Russia to sort of carry on the reforms? Should we really ask that much of Saudi Arabia? And there were huge fights within that task force between some of us who said, well, maybe if we move countries along a little bit more like Nigeria, Angola, Venezuela, you'll have a more stable source of supply. And those who said, no, we have to be realists, take these countries as they are. We need to ensure that they are stable suppliers and they supply us. So it was interesting from a policy perspective to have been at think tanks and governments in that period where there wasn't this thought of a North American energy revolution. I then joined Lehman Brothers and then Barclays. And even in 2008, when oil prices had collapsed after the big financial crisis, people were still so focused on supply disruption. I remember if there was even a hint of an Israeli attack on Iran, some type of crazy rumor about some type of troop movement, the market would move on that. People were singularly focused on Straits of Hormuz, supply disruption. Anything that could have a disruptive effect had an outsized impact on the market. And we did have major events after the Arab Spring that really did take significant supply off the market, Libya in particular. But you had continual problems in places like Nigeria. And at one point, we had 3 million barrels off the market in unplanned outages. And that was a major source of support, part of the reason behind why we had oil above 100. When I think about where we sit now, you can have days where you can have rocket attacks on gas facilities in Algeria. You can have ISIS attacks on Libyan energy infrastructure. You can have pipelines bombed in Nigeria. You can have attacks on underwater pipelines in Nigeria that take off major facilities. And the market doesn't seem to care at this point. Whereas I used to joke you could have one supply outage and the market would move, I now say in the story of abundant supply, you need 2 or 3 to have the same type of impact that you would have needed 4 years ago. And to me, I look at the market and say, gosh, if I just look at Nigeria, for example, how much that government is struggling. I mean, not just with Boko Haram, but with a resurgence of criminality in the oil region. They have this overvalued exchange rate that they will not change their policy on, so it's making it hard to fund their military at this point. They're having massive fuel shortage. You're looking at this country and saying, gosh, it's one of our fragile 5, it's at risk of implosion, and it's at risk that oil could be a casualty of that. When you have all these countries that are at the precipice of having some type of crisis, and yet it doesn't really get factored in the market. And so I think that you have a situation where the geopolitics of oil from the country standpoint and their fragility may not have looked worse in a long time, but yet it's not still priced in any meaningful way. I mean, with the freeze discussion, I think geopolitics started to return. I think that was a big, catalyst for the move where people said maybe for the first time the sovereign producers are waving the white flag and saying maybe we're not great in this oil price environment. But given the amount of stress these producers are under, I think the market is very complacent about the risks of real disruption. I think we could actually get a situation if we stay in the sub 45, sub 50 price environment where you could be looking at systemic fails amongst these producers. And I think we could see geopolitics returning to having some type of market premium if it leads to actual physical disruption. Because I think too many participants just believe that North American production, which is actually coming down, provides such a big buffer, inventories provide such a big buffer that we can weather any geopolitical storm. And I think that is we should not be complacent about that scenario. I think it could come roaring back and bite us if we're not, vigilant enough.
Helima, I'd just like to quickly follow up on your comments. You spoke about the precipice and, the 5 countries kind of potentially going off the cliff. Which would you identify as the most sort of vulnerable to the fall off the cliff? And also, could you just speak to Saudi Arabia? I mean, Saudi Arabia looks relatively good, as Robin had said, in terms of they're making some energy subsidy reform changes, but they have very much sort of dug into their sovereign wealth fund, and at this price level, they're going to have to continue to dig in. So if you could just sort of talk about the countries that you see as particularly the most vulnerable in the short term, and then just a few comments about Saudi Arabia.
Well, I've got my fabulous colleague here, Chris Looney, and we've got this great client up in Boston, I won't name him, but he basically said, I want some metrics for assessing, where these countries are. So we came up with this OPEC watch list, which we update, basically saying, which countries are best placed to deal with lower for longer and which ones are, again, on the verge of having some type of major systemic crisis. And so we do have 5 countries that we're worried about for, a variety of reasons. I mean, if you look at Libya, they basically have been sort of the Somalia of the oil markets. Now they've got 3 governments. There's been some hope for a situation turning, which I'm sure someone will talk about in this panel, but still, they have such a fragile political and security situation that we're not optimistic that they're going to turn the corner in this price environment. But then you do have the Nigerias, the Iraqs, Venezuela. Algeria we put in that camp because of the terrorism issue, the issues with the head of state, the fact that a little bit like many Gulf countries, the way they got through the Arab Spring was a massive injection of cash. And that gets me to the point of Saudi Arabia, where there's a view out there in the market, talking about how market participants see things, that they're uncorking the non-alcoholic champagne in Riyadh, basically saying, finally, U.S. production is rolling. We've taken it to U.S. producers. We're winning this battle. And one of the things that we keep going back to is saying, well, if this is winning, what does losing look like? I mean, Saudi Arabia had FX reserves of $734 billion in 2014. They're now down to under 600. So they've basically spent almost $150 billion since oil prices started to fall. And you can say, well, they've got 600 to go. But I think one of the big issues for Saudi Arabia is, do they want to maintain their currency peg? And if you want to maintain your currency peg, that $600 billion cannot be liquidated. It's a question of, do you need to maintain 350 or 400? And some people say, well, just break the peg. But I say that the problem of breaking the peg is they don't have a local manufacturing sector in Saudi Arabia. They're not like even Russia. We're devaluing, you have a local substitute. If you break that currency peg, you are really risking pushing inflationary effects across the entire Saudi population. And there's this view that, well, they're too rich to get rowdy. But I say, on a per capita basis, because Saudi Arabia has 30 million people, 20 million of whom are actually Saudis, if you look at the FX reserves spread across the entire population, it doesn't even go as far as the Libyan sovereign fund. And of that 20 million whom are Saudis, some people have said about 20% of that cohort can actually be classified as poor. So you do have real problems in Saudi Arabia. I mean, they're not on the precipice of being a Venezuela, but how they manage this transition, I think, will be enormously challenging for them. Because, again, they got through the Arab Spring because they had a lot of cash. I mean, they spent $130 billion on new social programs right after the events in Tunisia and in Egypt. And so right now they're having to ask Saudis to pay more potentially for basic services. And there was a great, I think Karen, the woman from the Wall Street Journal, Karen House Elliott, had this great line where she said, the bargain in Saudi Arabia has been prosperity, loyalty for prosperity. And what happens when you don't have the same type of prosperity? Are you going to be able to have the same type of loyalty? And you're going through a period where you have a young man, Mohammed bin Salman. He has been the spearheading the whole economic reform drive, but he's consolidated more power than any young man has basically had in Saudi Arabia. I mean, he controls all the important key positions: defense, energy policy, finance, all roll up into him. And so that, I think, does present potential political issues within the royal family. And so a lot of the things he's talking about are actually very important for the overall health of the Saudi economy. Like removing subsidies would be very beneficial. But the question is, can you bring your population along with you? Can you bring the rest of the family along with you? So I think we have to wait and see how Saudi handles this. But I don't think it's going to be as smooth sailing as many people in the financial markets or commentators on TV think it will be.
I think from the DoD, from the defense point of view, there's some very concerning trends there, because the same sort of young, new leadership transition, we're looking at changing our financial tools and the way we run our energy markets. They're also very aggressive in their defense posture in a way they've never been before. And it plays well with that young demographic that Robin talked about. So where does this go? And that's some pretty serious outlays they're making both in Yemen and in Syria and elsewhere. Very aggressive posture with Iran. Where does this go? And it's hard to see what the long-term plan there is for Saudi Arabia. So over the long term, there's a lot to be concerned about there.
Robin, can you say anything? I mean, the United States and Saudi Arabia have historically had a close relationship, but over the last 2 years, there definitely feels that there's a severing of that relationship to some degree, and in terms of with the lifting of Iran sanctions. So what do you see in terms of United States-Saudi relationships moving forward?
So I think part of that narrative, particularly in the press, that the U.S.-Saudi relationship wasn't going well, was based in part on the dynamic Helima just described of there was a time when we were very dependent on Saudi Arabia's exports, and when we became more of a producer and our numbers started jumping from 6 to 7 to 8 to 9 million barrels a day, it was just assumed that's it. The U.S.-Saudi relationship is going to be on a downward spiral. The U.S. doesn't need them anymore. It's going to be fine. And I think that was really overplayed in the media. We still have a very good relationship with Saudi Arabia, and we work with Saudi Arabia on a range of issues. Iran coming back online is tough for Saudi Arabia. The reason Iran was at the negotiating table and we got a deal is that we brought their oil exports down from about 3 million barrels a day to 1 million barrels a day, over 3 to 1 million barrels a day. That wasn't easy to do, particularly in an environment that we talked about where, the world, this is 2012, the world still said, don't mess with supply. Don't, because we can't, if there's a disruption, it will be the end of it. And so we actually, in order to implement that sanction, the president had to certify, he gave the right to the Secretary of State, but the Secretary of State had to certify every 6 months that oil markets could handle Iran being offline. So we kept Iran at 1 million barrels a day for about the last year until we came to the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JCPOA, and with that, Iran sanctions are lifted. Well, what we have said is that the sanctions relief has to be real, or the deal's not going to work. So the sanctions relief really doesn't mean that Iran can export again. It means that companies, non-U.S. companies, can go back into Iran and work in the energy sector. And, Iran could ramp up, they hope to ramp up, back to 3-4 million barrels a day of exports, 1 million barrels a day of exports. So I think that is nerve-wracking for Saudi Arabia. And I think that you saw a lot of the concern played out in the press with the OPEC freeze to freeze or not freeze, and is Iran going to be a part of that? And I think that in the next couple of weeks, you might see more of that in the press in the run-up to the next meeting.
Great. I just want to follow up on some of the comments you made about energy security in Europe. As you said, energy security has been enhanced to some degree in Europe in terms of there's less dependency on Russia. But how do you see in terms of the sanctions playing out over the short to medium term in Russia? Right now, Russia has been sort of pretty steady at over 10 million barrels a day. However, the sanctions have been fairly targeted to address future production. So how do you see it from a sort of U.S. national security perspective for Russian security, and the fact that their future production is somewhat in question, and the fact that at this price there are significant vulnerabilities in the country?
I think that's a great question. In Russia, so 2 things. I think the way Putin looks at oil is oil's for money, natural gas is for power. They get political leverage from natural gas, and they get income from oil. When we implemented our oil sanctions on Russia, you're absolutely right. They were on future production. So when we first designed the Russia sanctions, we had a lot of questions. Are you going to do to Russia what you did to Iran? Are you going to cut their oil exports? And Russia's a 10 million barrel a day producer. We are not going to play with their current production for exactly the reason that Helima outlined, worries about disruptions. So what we did is we targeted the sanctions at future production, oil production only, not natural gas, in the Arctic, deep offshore, or unconventional. And the idea was we won't mess with today's volumes so we don't cause supply disruptions, but Russia will be put on notice that production that they're counting on in 3 to 8 years is going to have a break on it and be slowed down. There were a couple of other kind of tenets of our sanctions against Russia. One was transatlantic unity, that whatever we did, the European Union would do with us and our other allies, Japan, Norway. So that has held. The reason for that is, if our companies aren't going to be participating with Russian companies in the deep offshore, Arctic, or unconventional, the only other companies in the world that can do that kind of work are Western companies or Japanese companies, in some cases Korean. So, we don't want our companies to be backfilled by another company who could come in from, a Statoil. So in fact, nobody has done that. The projects that U.S. companies can't participate in, nor can European companies, and we have maintained that transatlantic unity. But again, we're talking about future production. So you've seen current conventional production start to taper off. Mm-hmm. I think Russia is worried. I think they're worried about their oil markets. I think they're very worried about their natural gas exports. Europe needs Russia for natural gas, but Russia needs Europe too. They've got massive pipelines, infrastructure that they've invested right downstream to their biggest customer. They've talked a lot about exporting to Asia, but that's not happening yet, except for some LNG. And so when you see LNG becoming more competitive, when you see natural gas prices converging closer to the U.S. price, I think Russia's very, very worried about their natural gas export markets.
Sharon, do you have any thoughts on Russia and what's going on?
Yeah, a couple of things. One is I think we get to find out what the price elasticity of corruption is in this,
Yes.
right? Because that's really the sanctions were targeted at.
Yeah.
And that is the money that you have to take off the top to buy political support. So that is sometimes where you feel it first. So I think that's been very interesting to watch. The relationship between Russia and China, which has had lots of press releases and lots of hope, but not lots of actual groundbreaking, will be interesting, and I think something that you got to watch very closely. You said that Russia looks to oil for money and gas for power. There's a third trade in there too, which is weapons and arms. And sometimes the arms trades move in sync with oil. So oil prices go down, arms trades go up with Russia. China's a little counter-cyclical because they're trading, their values are different, and they're forming relationships with producers, and sometimes security is part of that relationship and that coinage as well. And it was one thing I wanted to also bring up that I thought Helima or Robin, you might want to comment on as well, which is with Saudi Arabia, we're no longer the biggest consumer in the market, and that's a vacuum that is being filled by other big consumers, specifically China. And this China-Saudi Arabia relationship is really interesting. And there's foreign direct investment there, there's a lot of offtake, all of that now the China-Saudi relationship is becoming closer. And what does that mean for the long term too? Because strategic and security relationships tend to follow where the money is too. So there's some realignments in there that are worth watching, both for Russia and for Saudi Arabia and China.
Well, I was actually going to ask Helima about how she sees sort of the deceleration that's happening in China and what its demand outlook looks like. Although it has, in terms of when you look at oil, they have increased their imports of oil in the last month.
And one of the things I think is actually great about this, what you just brought up with the China-Saudi relationship is, again, one of the effects of the North American energy revolution is we still take imports, obviously, from Saudi Arabia and the rest of the world, but we need less. And the phenomenon, I think, for China really is like crowded house. And you have a situation right now, and I think this is what makes a sort of cooperation amongst sovereign producers within OPEC so challenging right now is they're chasing fewer markets. And so the battle for market access in Asia is just heating up. And you have situations where on any given month, Saudi Arabia is bested by Russia as the top supplier into China. You see it happening with being supplanted into India by countries like Iraq, sometimes like Nigeria. And so this is a fiercely competitive situation, is like gaining market access. And you see efforts, I think, now to buy refineries so you have a captive market for your product. But what Iran's re-entry into the oil markets does is it makes this competition for market access even more challenging. And so it's not just that Iran is putting more barrels onto the market, it's what price they'll sell it at to get that access. And we're starting to see Iran offer very aggressive terms to get that market access. So as I think we go into this Doha meeting, part of the problem is in getting these producers to the table is, how do you come up with an agreement where if Iran doesn't participate and they undercut you, what does that do to your market share? And I think that has been a real effect of North America is it's made the battle for market access just so much more competitive. And we were seeing that all last year with Nigeria. Nigeria is not a natural supplier really for India in terms of the barrel they produce. But if you sell your product at enough of a discount, you can win that market. And so it does have a real negative effect in terms of dragging down price. And again, I think this is just set to heat up. I mean, we are cautiously optimistic on China. My colleague always says we're not raging bulls on Chinese growth, but we're cautiously optimistic that they'll grow by 700,000 barrels this year. Part of it also is they have 110 million in SPR capacity coming on this year. So in a lower price environment, they'll back up the truck and fill that. So we don't see Chinese growth, stalling out to zero. We still see it, growing by several hundred thousand barrels. But Iran's reentry just makes the battle for that market so much fiercer.
I think you pretty much answered the question. This is kind of a question for all three panelists in terms of, given the talks on the 17th, some people see it as potentially a big story, and others see it in terms of whether or not there will be a production freeze, but Saudi Arabia has said that they're not going to freeze unless Iran participates. And Helima, you're suggesting that Iran's not going to participate because it wants its market.
But the
share.
thing is, I think is so interesting, and this is where Mohammed bin Salman, like I think about like things that you never used to have to think about covering these markets. And I used to think about Saudi as sort of very sort of consensus-driven politics, very thoughtful, you know, almost like moving a battleship sometimes. I mean, I feel like now it's a bit of whiplash because just 2 weeks ago, we had the Saudi oil minister, Ali Naimi, out there saying, well, a freeze will work. It doesn't matter if Iran participates, we'll get an agreement. And then we had the Mohammed bin Salman 5-hour Bloomberg interview where he seemed to imply in quite strong terms that if Iran didn't participate, there'd be no Saudi participation, and that seemed to kill it. But I say, gosh, you know, who knows what happens between now and Sunday? And I think what is interesting is that a year ago, you kind of had all the GCC countries sort of moving in lockstep. And what I think is interesting now is you still have countries like Kuwait basically out there saying, we are going to get this done. You have Qatar really trying to get this done. And these are the countries that are probably the best place to ride out a low oil price environment. And the fact that you have GCC countries really concerned about getting a higher oil price. I mean, for them, a recovery to 50 is important because it means you won't get sovereign credit downgrades. And I think they were very concerned, some of these countries, about getting downgraded when Moody's put them on a watch list. So if the Saudis stick to the position that Iran has to freeze at some level, it's going to be hard to get it done. But maybe there is a creative solution crafted in the next couple days. I mean, I'm not ruling it out, but you know, I think it's going to be a real challenge.
Any other thoughts? Robin? Sharon?
Sounds about right.
Okay, excellent. So Sharon, I want to turn to you and sort of shift gears a little bit. You spoke in your comments about climate change. And, you know, in terms of, you gave some very significant numbers in terms of U.S. fuel use during the time in Afghanistan. How do you see sort of the U.S. military sort of shifting its take on energy use in terms of, you see military decisions changing in terms of type of warfare, but how do you sort of see that the United States military and Department of Defense sort of re-examining or a paradigm shift in energy use in the future?
I don't really.
Oh, you don't?
Not really, because you know, when you get right down to it, war is, if you're looking for environmental policy, war is not a good place to look. War is just not environmentally friendly ever. And it consumes a lot and it destroys, always. So the best thing you could do for your energy policy when you're talking about the military is don't go to war, because you will always consume and destroy. Now, having said that, defense, and especially the American military, is an enormous enterprise, and it takes a lot of inputs to support it. So it's, I think it's something like 4 billion gallons a year that they consume in petroleum fuel. Their electricity bill is $4 billion a year. That fuel bill this year is going to be $14 billion. And that's a problem, but not even as a cost factor. It's the kinds of wars that we're in these days and are likely to be fighting these kinds of wars for some time. You know, it used to be that we would be behind our own front lines and we would protect our forces. And there'd be, you know, some running of those lines from all sides, but we still had our own front lines. And we don't fight that way now. We're all in the battlefield. It's distributed warfare. It's all over the place. Everything's a target. And that means all of our supply lines are in the battlefield. In the last 14 years of war, those supply lines have gotten hit. And we've been facing guerrilla warfare, irregular warfare, people who are not necessarily particularly well equipped, but they can hit those supply lines. And what happens is U.S. forces have to protect them. That means they're not doing other things. It means that people die. People always die in war, but if you're not doing everything you can to minimize that risk, then you're not very good at taking care of your military. So what defense has looked at is, are we taking too much risk on the battlefield because of the amount of fuel that we use? And are there things we can do to control that, to bring the numbers down? And the answer was yes, we are taking more risk than we should be. And yes, there are things we can do to decrease that risk and to shrink that supply line and to give our forces more capability. And that has been a range of things. Sometimes it's more efficient aircraft engines, because airplanes use a lot of fuel. Sometimes it's, if you are living in a tent in Afghanistan, where it's 10 degrees in the winter and 115 in the summer, and it's not insulated, you're going to have to use an awful lot of energy to keep it cool or to keep it warm. But a layer of insulation can cut the demand in half. So they've been doing things like insulating their shelters and using LED lights and using solar to run the power needs at some remote locations. That decreases the risk, gives them more capability. So things like that are going on. And when you look forward at the future, President Obama has directed the entire national security apparatus to rebalance to the Asia-Pacific region and to think about security and about building security in that region. Well, that's a long way from home. That's a very long supply line, and ships and planes use an awful lot of fuel. And also, we're talking about a future where you're going to see more humanitarian disaster relief missions. You're going to need to go farther more often. And where also, if we do face adversaries in this region, they're going to have much more lethal, much more precise weapons that can really target these big supply lines. So the Department of Defense has an interest in improving their own energy security and using less fuel. And then also with electricity, there's an increasing ability to target those supplies as well with viruses, with other means. So the department has to look in terms of resilience and shrinking its supply line. And that's a very powerful driver for the military and a driver for innovation. So if you're looking to them to have a good environmental policy and to drive decarbonization, they're not the right place. But for reasons of their own, they may be driving innovation that will have that outcome and that effect, and that's a good thing.
Can you identify any specific innovations that you see as being sort of the most likely to see in the near future?
Some of them come from oblique angles. Mm-hmm. Like, for example, they're looking at nanotechnologies that'll greatly decrease fuel demand for all kinds of capabilities. DARPA has this great project for unmanned systems where the drone is all solar. Mm. And it's not because they love solar panels, it's because it can stay aloft for many, many months without being refueled. It has no sound, and it has no heat signature. So they get everything they want out of this. So they may be pioneering entirely new use of solar energy storage for a variety of reasons is a good technology for them. Fuel cells, they're looking at fuel cells and the possibility of using those. As I said, tactical solar on the battlefield. There's a range of things going on there, even things as dramatic as completely different airplane shapes and bodies and materials, lots of different materials. So there's a range of things. They're not all energy per se. Mm-hmm. It gets into how do you use energy. So if you're really going to change your energy mix, you have to look at how you use it, not just at what you use.
Great, thank you. Robin, just want to turn now to East Asia. The LNG market has dramatically changed over the last few years, and prices for LNG have gone down precipitously, especially in Asia, from what it was a couple of years ago. How do you see sort of East Asian energy security with regards to LNG? And I guess since we're sort of in East Asia in terms of the conversation, if you could also sort of speak to the South China Sea and where the United States is in terms of how it's looking at the South China Sea and relationship there.
Yeah. And actually I think to talk about natural gas in Asia, it's also a good tie-in to what's happening in the world of renewable energy and demand management, because it's critically important for Asia. So on natural gas, like we already talked a little bit about the numbers, especially U.S. LNG exports. In fact, in 2 weeks, I'm going to the Cheniere facility at Sabine Pass in Louisiana for their big opening. The first LNG facility, they're going to be exporting, like I said, they did their first trial shipment to Brazil a couple weeks ago. But that facility plus the others that are being built or that have will come to commerciality, will be putting up to 100 billion cubic meters of natural gas on the market in the next 5 to 10 years. So if you looked at a pie chart of where natural gas was, LNG, in 2015, I think we're about 350 BCM a year of LNG trade. And there's no pie for the United States at all, zero, right? If you look in 2025, it's about 550 BCM of global LNG trade. The United States is 20% of it. It's just a massive transformation in a short amount of time. And at the same time that we ramp up like that, so does Australia, which is coming online with a lot of quantity. So what's that mean for Asia? You already put your finger on the exact issue, which is that prices are becoming more competitive. I mean, the price differential between U.S. gas and gas that Asia was buying was anywhere from $3 to $18 3 or 4 years ago, and that is really, those prices are really converging. So I think that whereas Asian buyers used to only be looking at long-term, 20-year take-or-pay contracts at relatively high prices, it's more of a buyer's market today, and probably Helima can talk about this in more depth, but there's a lot more spot trading, shorter 5-year contracts, 10-year contracts. There are volumes that Australia and U.S. suppliers have that aren't tied up into long-term contracts, so some of that is being traded. So I think that a place like Japan has a little bit more flexibility. It gives them flexibility not only in price and structure of their contract, but it allows them to do things like take a hard look at electricity sector reform that they couldn't do before. I don't think you can talk about Asian demand growth and energy issues without talking about climate, because as we said, it's a demand transformation, but that means that some of the biggest consumers of energy today are some of the biggest emitters, China and India more than anywhere else, but Southeast Asia as well. So nothing that we do on climate change, nothing we do matters if we don't bend the demand curve for coal in Asia, if we don't bend the demand curve for coal in China, India, and Southeast Asia, and stop building coal-fired plants. So how do you do that? I mean, gas is a big part of the answer, but so is renewable energy and demand management. So when I travel in Southeast Asia or other Asian countries, the most questions I get are about what is the U.S. doing? What are the new technological breakthroughs on the renewable energy side? They know wind and solar are more competitive, but what else can we do? Is battery storage really going to become competitive? How do we drive the prices down? How do you use smart meters and smart grid technology and demand management analytics to really change the demand picture in a place like China? And I think that coupled with the gas picture will be what drives real climate policy in Southeast Asia and China and India in the next decade. And I think it'll be fascinating to watch.
So are you relatively optimistic that they can sort of change their sort of demand picture and also sort of shift where they get their supply from?
Look, I think that the Paris Agreement and that we had 186 countries come to the table, make serious commitments. They're not binding commitments, but one element of the Paris Agreement that was binding is that countries have to publish what they're doing, and they have committed to reevaluating their targets going forward. I think the fact that we got a country like China, the United States, Europe, India to make serious commitments and put some money behind not only implementing those commitments, but helping countries that are least prepared to implement their own INDCs, I think is a good sign. I'm more optimistic today, certainly, than I was a year ago.
Great.
Sharon? I think it's going to be very hard, and sometimes I feel like this is a dialogue that hasn't benefited from being polarized, where you get people on one side who say it can't be done. The world is overwhelmingly dependent on fossil fuels, can't be done, it'll kill the economy, and then people on the other side who are like, has to be done, it'll be easy. There will be nothing easy about this. This is a formidable transition that has to happen. And I think sometimes it's hard to stay optimistic, but then you get reminders every now and then that there are reasons to be, like you had pointed me towards the International Energy Agency's recent report that we're seeing a decoupling for the first time of the generation of carbon emissions and economic growth, so that economies are growing at the same time that emissions are falling. And even within those numbers, China's so dependent on coal, and but even within that number, in the last few years, they've gone from 80% dependence in their electricity sector to 70%. And I mean, 10% is a big drop in just a few years, in just 3 years. So every now and then you get reminders that you can be optimistic, and then also that you have to be optimistic. Because if you just start from here and you say, oh, we have to completely change this energy economy, you'll say it can never happen. But instead, invert it and say, 25 years from now, it has to happen. It has to happen. So now look at it instead of how do we get there from here, and choose to be optimistic because we need it to succeed. So a little of both. I think it's good to be realistic, though.
Well, I've been surprised because I've been to a couple of panels here, and I was also at a recent panel where someone from the World Bank, a new report is coming out in May, looking at the idea of stranded assets. And in a panel, this one panel that, as I said, I was a part of, that the author of the report basically said that there's a good chance that there are countries that will hold very significant stranded assets in the next 20 to 30 years because the disruptions are happening and we are seeing a paradigm shift. So I guess we'll have to wait and see what happens, right? Helima, I have to, because I got called out a couple of months ago when I moderated a panel at NYU, and I didn't ask a question about the United States sort of outlook for energy. So I'm going to make sure that I ask you in terms of, we are starting to see a fall in production here in the United States. So what is your overall outlook for U.S. production at this price? And then I know that you're not very bullish, but I know that you see sort of $50 oil by the end of it.
Yes.
I look at your
mantra on air. But I mean, I think that what's so interesting is that you are starting to see U.S. production. It is rolling. But the sort of million-dollar question is, if we get this recovery to 50, how fast does it start to come back? And I think there is actually a live debate. I mean, when I go to Houston, to be honest, there's a split of opinion. Maybe some of the producers are talking their book because they don't want to basically talk down the price of oil. But you do have producers now, you saw this at CERAWeek with companies like Hess out there saying, no, Saudi Arabia, you still are the swing producer, don't look to us. It's going to take time to get people back to work, to put rigs back to work. It's not going to snap back immediately. And then you have other analysts saying, no, 45, 50, producers are going to start hedging this, and you're going to get a wall of production coming back. Our view is we think it's easier to move from 40 to 50, but that 50 to 60 is where the challenge is. And it's partially because of inventories having to be worked off, but partially it is because of the new wave of producer hedging. And I think really it is a changed energy landscape, at least in the short term, because of North American production. But eventually, the effects of this much CapEx coming out of the market, hundreds of billions of dollars in CapEx coming out of the markets. Over the medium term, the U.S., even with hedging, is not enough to balance this market. And we're concerned particularly about what projects don't get developed in a sub-$70, sub-$80 oil price environment. What does that do for offshore Brazil, offshore West Africa? Projects that have, decline rates on U.S. production, it's pretty shallow decline rates. But, where can you get these projects where the oil flows for a long period of time? It's these deep water projects. So what happens over the medium term with these deferrals in projects? And also, I looked at countries like Iraq. Your office has done such spectacular work when we say, why didn't oil move faster last year? It's partially because of Iraqi production. Iraqi production was up between 600,000 and 100,000 barrels year on year, despite the economic crash Iraq was having. They still managed to really grow production because of, in part, some of the work the U.S. government was doing with the Iraqi government. But the question is, what does the next wave of Iraq look like? Can Iraq really get to, a major growth in production? Can they be producing, 6.5 million barrels without, in this type of price environment if companies are not willing to put additional capital in? So I think the real question is going to be 3 to 5 years out. If the U.S. is the only place that is still growing, what does that look like in terms of a price environment?
And does this, this is a question for both Robin and Sharon. Does the U.S. outlook in terms of when you think about U.S. national security, does that play into the way that you think about security in the future in terms of where the United States is in terms of its own energy production?
Well, I think going back to the point that I made in the very beginning, that we never talk about energy independence. We're not independent. And energy security requires that you pay attention to global markets. The markets are so interconnected. And You talked earlier about some of the potential disruption spots. I mean, if they did all happen at once, if Iran didn't come back online and Libya stayed offline, I mean, Libya's down 1 million barrels a day, right? 1.5 million. And let's say that the Middle East, there are a lot of things that could happen that could immediately impact our national security. So, but I think another important point to make is that if we were sitting here 4 years ago and we were talking about where we are, right, we would be at $100 oil, 6 million barrels a day production for the United States, wind and solar only competitive with massive subsidies. Libya would still be online. We'd have Iran sanctions, and we wouldn't even conceive of putting sanctions on Russia, right? So if just 4 years later, we're at $40 oil today. Did it end at 40? 39. 9 million barrels a day production, LNG exporter, no Iran sanctions, but Russia sanctions, and wind and solar competitive in some cases with hydrocarbons. So I think that anybody who sat up here and said you can guess where we're going to be in 5 or 10 years is either a liar or in the wrong profession, because they could be making a lot more money. So I think that the way we look at it from a national security perspective is that we to work with our partners around the world on diversification. The U.S. policy is an all-of-the-above energy strategy, right? We do it all. Not every country has to do it all, but you have to do some basket of things. So in our case, we do nuclear and hydrocarbons and renewables and demand management. Some countries aren't doing anything more than 1 or 2, and it's just not a good long-term strategy to be dependent. And it's why, going back to the Europe example, we've worked so closely with our European partners on diversification of not only their fuel sources and types, but of the routes and the suppliers, because all of that is critical for security in the long term.
Great, thanks. Anything to add?
No, I would agree with that. And the U.S. policy, even though the details and the mix of it change, it's pretty consistent, which is diversification. And there's going to be security challenges with our energy policy no matter what it is. So even if we succeed in displacing hydrocarbons, that's going to cause problems in a lot of countries that are important to us. So we're going to have to consider the national security dimension of whatever our energy policy is, whatever our domestic mix is.
Okay, well, I have a lot more questions, but I want to make sure that our audience has an opportunity. So if you do have a question, please, Jully has a microphone. And for those watching online, again, you can use the hashtag CGEP events and our Twitter handle @ColumbiaUEnergy to ask a question. So while I'll take the first question from Twitter. Robin, this is for you. Could you talk about Iran's gas exports to Europe? How is it affecting U.S., Saudi, Iran, Russia relations? Small question, just.
So Iran's not back online yet, except for to Turkey, which they were exporting to during the sanctions. So I think in the immediate term, Iran's gas exports to Europe, I mean, right now it's not happening. But going back to this oversupply in the gas market, I think that Iran, so we already talked about U.S. and Australia coming online with LNG, but we also have Caspian gas that will be hitting the market through the Southern Gas Corridor starting in 2019. The Italian company Eni has had a major gas discovery in the Eastern Mediterranean with the Zohr field off the coast of Egypt. Israel has 2 gas fields, major gas fields. Cyprus has 1. So you have a lot of gas coming online, and I think that it's going to continue to be, and I'm not a commodities analyst, so I defer to my colleague. I think you're going to continue to see a very well-supplied gas market, both pipeline and LNG, and I think you're going to see competitive prices. And in Europe, I think if they do build the infrastructure that they're talking about building, more interconnectors between countries that have a reverse flow capability, more compressor stations where they're necessary, and LNG terminals in places where they're not, because they have a lot of them in some countries and they're underutilized, but they don't have any in other places. I think you're going to see a very well-integrated kind of competitive gas market in Europe. I hope so. I hope it doesn't look like the gas market that was there in 2009 when Russia cut off gas to Ukraine.
Great, thank you. I think we have a question right here.
Hello, yeah. My name is Devansh and I'm from the journalism school over here. So we recently had a talk with Ambassador Dan Fried, who's in charge of the Russia sanctions, and he's saying a large part of the effectiveness, which is like why Russia is being squeezed now, is also the low oil prices. So does the president's like when you're deciding national security matters, do you also look at like when you're deciding whether to ban fracking or not, whether to restrict fracking, would you also consider the geopolitical scenario when making such policies, or is it just considering, the individual, the country? Yeah.
That's such a great question. So Dan Fried is a very good colleague and close friend, and actually a brilliant, brilliant diplomat. He forged an U.S.-European consensus on our Russia sanctions. He's right that a lot of the impact on Russia was some part of our sanctions, but the bigger impact, frankly, was the drop in oil price. And so one question that we got asked around the world is that, did you engineer this? Did you engineer the drop in oil? And I thought, can you see the CEO of Exxon taking a call from President Obama who says, hey, I want you to do X, Y, and Z so we can keep the oil price down.
But the rest of the world thinks we can, because everybody else works that way, right?
Yes.
Most oil is in the hands of national oil companies.
That's right.
So it's not an unreasonable.
It's not, but that is it's a myth. It's a myth that we work to debunk all the time. That's the same myth comes about with natural gas. When the U.S. started putting LNG in the market, we were told, you all should really help out Europe and make sure that cargoes go to Europe first. Okay, Cheniere is going to take a call from me and say, I want you to send your first shipment to country X. So we did not engineer the oil price drop, but it did have, Dan Fried is absolutely right, it did have a significant impact on Russia.
And when all of the U.S. executive branch is sitting around a table and talking about policy issues, there will be a voice at the table, perhaps from the Pentagon, making the point that a favorable natural gas export policy is good for our security interests overseas. But that might not be persuasive for Pennsylvania, right? So the way that we make energy policy in this country is still going to get made that way. And I would say some of the really interesting dilemmas in that are in places like Oklahoma, where something like 2/3 of the jobs in the state depend on oil and gas, and they've seen they've a 500% increase in earthquakes that are related to disposal wells. They've got some tough choices to make, but they're not going to be looking at whether or not that benefits our overseas security. They're going to be looking at it as a local issue. And I think at the end of the day, U.S. energy security and energy politics, they're local.
But it is amazing when you talk about the sort of conspiracy theories. Like, it's not just people overseas looking at the U.S. thinking that we engineered this. I have so many clients who will be like, this is the U.S. and Saudi relationship actually working extremely well. It's almost the opposite view that you get. That on the one hand, they'll say we're fighting over Iran, but behind closed doors, that the Saudis and the U.S. have engineered this to punish Iran and Russia. So what I find is amazing is the saliency of this idea. It's not just people sitting in the Middle East or in African countries saying it's designed to hurt us. It's really clients. It's people actually believing that the U.S. really did somehow have this sort of hidden hand that they could, orchestrate this price collapse, which gives you tremendous power out there.
Well, and U.S. and Saudi have collaborated for a long time on market stability. So there's flame under that smoke as well.
So I have another question here from Twitter, and Helima, this is for you, and this is from Steve Levine. I think you probably know Steve. His reports. Hi, Steve. If you're listening, I know Steve. Is Saudi positioning itself to reassert some control over the market, or is it or is it the same, or is it the sure old days are gone? The old days are gone?
Because I was actually, the contrast between the sort of June OPEC meeting and seminar in December was striking. I loved the June OPEC seminar where Ali Naimi essentially jumped up on stage, and it was like a victory lap. But he said the future looks bright for oil. We're in the midst of a demand-driven recovery. And speaker after speaker, particularly from the Gulf states, were like, the recovery is coming. And people were talking about a recovery to 70 by year end, maybe 75, latest to be Q1. And then you got the reversal. And what I think is so interesting is that at the Vienna meetings, the couple days before the meeting, there were the reports that there was going to be some type of effort to get a statement, sort of the forward guidance OPEC statement, that would say that they weren't going to cut production this time, but that OPEC was prepared potentially in 2016 to become more assertive if you didn't get a recovery in prices. So a little bit of the waving the white flag, saying we're not going to indefinitely sit on the sidelines. Now, maybe that was partially because Saudi Arabia was worried about a lot of criticism they were getting going into the OPEC meeting that were pushing half of OPEC over a cliff. But what was interesting was who ruined that effort was really the Iranians. I mean, you had the Iranians out there in Vienna, Zanganeh, the energy minister, saying, under no circumstances will we participate in any type of production freeze. We're not going to cut production. No way till we're back to 4 million. And then you had the Iraqis come out and say, we're not going to do this either. And if you're Saudi Arabia and you have the one country that's going to be putting additional barrels on the market, and the one country in OPEC that really contributed to oversupply besides the Saudis saying, don't look to us, I think that's part of the reason why the December meeting ended in such disaster. I mean, the body language and those ministers walked out in December was horrific. And the reason we don't have a ceiling anymore with an OPEC and collective ceiling is they couldn't agree on anything. But I do think the free statement was important. I think I'm in a camp of maybe a small number of people who thought the free statement was important because it was the first time in over a year where there was some type of signal by the sovereign producers that all was not well. I mean, the Saudis spent the entire year saying, we have the runway to deal with this, we have huge FX reserves, we have the ability to borrow, we're good. Russia, I mean, Igor Sechin jumped in front of every camera he could get in front of as soon as there was any idea of OPEC, non-OPEC cooperation being floated, saying under no circumstances will Russia participate. And at that June seminar, you had the Russian energy minister up on stage saying, not only are we not going to participate, but essentially, like, we don't even think OPEC is relevant in the face of U.S. production. Like, who gets to invite him back again? He was the skunk at the party. But the fact that you had Russia basically saying they would participate, and Russia continuing to say, we're going to show up, even with the Saudi reversal, I mean, I think it is meaningful. I think it's meaningful. And I think, you know, the question is, if we don't get the recovery, are these countries facing, you know, a potential Moody's downgrade? If we get to December and we don't get that recovery, do they become more active? I think the freeze is important because I think it signaled a potential willingness to become more active if you don't get a recovery.
Great, thank you. Do you have some more questions? We have a question hand there in the back.
Hi, you talked about the price environment for oil, and I wondered, you talked about, you know, supply and demand reasons and political reasons impacting that. I wanted to know if renewables are going to play a role in that. Obviously, if the price of oil increases, that makes renewables more competitive. So I just want to see if you could comment on that, please.
Renewables?
You know, it's interesting that when prices were high, the thought was, you know, renewables would be much more competitive and countries would look more to them. But, you know, it didn't stop. The integration of renewables onto grids all around the world didn't slow down when oil went down to 30. So I do think that we are, you know, in the United States, it was a mixture of policy incentives, you know, some tax breaks and federal and state policy regulations and the Clean Power Plan and other a basket of incentives that led to that. But in other places around the world that don't even have those in place, we've seen an increased integration of renewables based on their competitiveness regardless of where oil and gas prices are. So I think that the technological advances that I mentioned before, the competitiveness with hydrocarbons, the storage technology, I think battery storage is really going to change the way renewables are integrated. And then having the firming power, having countries be able to have their baseload power with natural gas at affordable prices are actually, you know, if anything, accelerating some of the integration.
Great.
Helima, I just want to interject on how quick we're going to come back online.
Yeah.
You know, that's what I do for a living.
Yeah.
And in 2013, 14, we had 202 rigs working just in the Bakken. There are 29 working there now.
Yeah.
All the man camps are empty.
Yeah.
All machines are being used. All the pressure pumpers, all the rigs are being used cannibalized for parts. If any one of those monkeys on Wall Street thinks that we're turning on that quickly, they can go get a job up in the fields because they won't have a job on Wall Street.
Yeah.
And now, the actual question that I have is, we've seen the oil prices between 2010 and 2014 were about $100.
Yeah.
And in that time frame, the only place that we saw any production increase was North America.
Yeah.
So somehow, magically, oil prices are now $40,
Yeah.
and America's rolling over on production.
Yeah.
And where we're going to find our natural decline and where we're going to find the oil that we need to maintain the world order.
No,
That's on the defense side also.
Yeah, I think this is like the great question when people say, well, we can never get, like, 80 is in the rearview mirror permanently. I mean, I think that becomes the question is that, I think Iraq is the most important story for me because I look at, like, outside of North America, who was supposed to be the biggest contributor to the supply story? It was supposed to be Iraq. I mean, Iraq was supposed to go to, by the projections of the IEA in their base case, 8.5 million barrels by 2035. And I look at that and I say, the biggest contributor to OPEC production growth was supposed to be Iraq. And I'm looking at the combination of ISIS and this price environment. And I'm just wondering, how can Iraq make this work? I mean, Iraq has had the biggest divergence between the economic, the security story, and the oil story. But how long can they continue to outrun this? And at what point does Iraq simply cap out because there's no more investment going in there? And companies didn't like investing in Iraq when oil was 100. And, no, I know. And so I look at that country and I say, that is like the biggest one that if it doesn't come on, and I don't see how they come on, but that is where, like, we were supposed to get the single largest source of supply was supposed to come from Iraq. And I look at this and I'm like, you guys did an amazing job last year, and Iraqis did an amazing job increasing production. Some of it was that pipeline that came online in the north. But how they are able to continue this story, I just don't see it. And so where do I think, if you want to be an optimist on oil prices, I mean, you can't look at this period of, and companies react so quickly on the downside in terms of particularly IOCs and aggressive cost cutting. And I just don't see over the medium term how this is going to keep prices at a very low level unless we have something greater on the demand side. But that's what, people like Abdelaziz bin Salman, the Vice Minister of Oil in Saudi Arabia. I mean, the one I think that's come closest to publicly calling for production cuts, he's been doing it by essentially saying that we're setting the stage for a massive run-up in prices in several years that's going to be terrible for the global economy and ultimately terrible for demand because we simply don't have enough investment in this environment. This price environment is not enough to get the barrels that we need to come online.
Defense is, it's not that as a government entity is certainly concerned about production at home, but DoD buys about 60% of its fuel overseas because fuel is heavy and bulky, and so you want to buy it as close as you can to where you operate. So the Pentagon's always going to have an interest in seeing a healthy supply system as long as that's what they're using, and that's going to be for a long time. So they're going to be watching the global dynamics, both in terms of how it affects national security interests and how it affects them as a consumer of fuel in the global market.
Thank you. Wow, we're going to take these 3 questions right here, and then.
Hi, the question will be mostly regarding the Iranian deal and its impact for the oil energy market today. So how is the sanction on the Iranian deal are really impacting the market from a point of policy versus law, and how are the winner and the loser of the Iranian deal so far profiting from the geopolitical conjuncture? Thanks.
Thank you. Who'd like to take the Iran deal winners and losers?
Maybe I can do the deal and you can do the markets.
I was going to say, it sounds like a U.S. government question to me.
Yes.
So here's the U.S. government. I think we're all winners from the deal, actually. But we have to understand what the deal is. The deal is really only about Iran's nuclear program and nothing else. So the sanctions that we lifted, the United States lifted, were only nuclear-related sanctions. And our nuclear-related sanctions included, so we still have a whole host of sanctions on Iran for other things, missiles, terrorism, human rights. So when Americans think of the U.S. embargo against Iran, the bulk of the embargo remains in place. What we did lift was secondary sanctions on non-U.S. companies who want to work in and invest in Iran's energy sector. So, a European company that wants to do business, a European oil company that wants to do business in Iran, before the deal would have been subject to U.S. sanctions and today is not. But U.S. companies still cannot go into Iran and invest in the energy sector. The other most important sanction for markets that we lifted, for immediate markets, was the ban on Iranian oil exports. We didn't actually have a ban. Iran had to be decreasing its exports, and importers of Iranian oil had to be decreasing their imports of Iranian oil. And so we had that drop that I mentioned before to about 1 million barrels a day of exports. And that, what you're going to see happening, I think, is you'll see that million, you already see it ramping up from Iran's biggest importers, China, India. You'll see Korea buying more. You'll see Japan buying more. They've already had some oil go to Europe. I think you'll see some European buyers start to ramp up. They also had a lot of oil in storage, something between 30 and 50 million barrel in storage. And so you'll start to see that come online. The bigger question for the longer term is how fast companies actually go into the energy sector and make these investments that Helima was talking about. And I think that is because of the price environment we're in and the challenges that we're in. I think that's going to happen slower than Iran had hoped, but that many analysts think.
Yeah, and I think
Thinking about the reluctance of the U.S. Department of Treasury when you mentioned the
dollar
U.S.
transaction.
government, specifically the Department of Treasury.
Right. Well, I think that the remaining U.S. sanctions, not related to the nuclear deal, still have an impact on companies, right? Because companies are worried about compliance with U.S. sanctions. And so because so much of our financial sanctions still remain in place, a non-U.S. company that deals with the U.S. banking sector, that has transactions that go through New York, is very, very worried about. And we have spent a lot of time and money trying to educate. We have a team that's gone out around the world trying to educate about what is and isn't allowed. And our Office of Foreign Assets Control at the Treasury Department has put out pages and pages on its website trying to explain this to compliance lawyers all over the world.
No, but I think this is the big question. I mean, we think it's probably Iran can ramp up to like 500,000 additional, but the question is when they have their 4 million number out there, making that leap past 500 on a sustainable basis once you move through floating storage is going to require another wave of investment. And the European companies, like analysts see European energy company CEOs going to Iran and think they're just about to go back in. But I mean, it's not just a low oil price environment, it's the tough terms Iran tends to offer. And someone was once explained to me that it was sort of a mini version, a little bit of what happened with PDVSA in Venezuela under Chavez. The national oil company in Iran under Ahmadinejad, was no longer necessarily the bastion of technocratic excellence in Iran. A lot of cronyism there. And the question is, are they going to be able to come up with even contract terms to incentivize the companies to go back in? And then the sort of kind of a secondary issue that I hear companies talk about a little bit is that the difference between the European sanctions and the U.S. sanctions on energy is a lingering concern about waivers. And the question is, under the Obama administration, or Democrat in the White House, the view that, waivers will remain in place. But if you get someone different in the White House, does that potentially change the U.S. sanctions posture? So I do think that's part of the secondary reluctance of some of these companies to come back in, is to say, well, what is the U.S.-Iran policy going to look like after the election? And if the U.S. sanctions related to energy are mainly wavered at this point, what's the durability of the sanctions relief?
And snapback.
Snapback.
The snapback provisions. If Iran doesn't meet its commitments under its nuclear commitments in the deal, then part of the deal is that we could snap back to prior sanctions, and that
And that's
is a word for
everyone.
companies.
That's not just the United States.
Right.
That was part of the deal.
That's right.
So.
Great. We just have 2 final questions, and then we're going to have to wrap up. I saw a hand here, and then right there.
Hi, first off, I'd like to thank you for being here. Your analysis has been wonderful and very insightful. So my question is, I think this is more for you, Robin. And my question here is, in regard to the proposed Trans-Caspian pipeline connecting Turkmenistan with Azerbaijan, specifically Baku, how will that pipeline influence Russian geopolitics in the Caucasus and in that area? Thank you.
That's a good question. It's a very good question. So whether or not the Trans-Caspian pipeline happens, I don't know. I don't know the timeline. I know they're talking. The Europeans are involved in the discussions. The Vice President for European Energy Security, Shevchevich, has been in discussions with all of the parties, Turkey, Azerbaijan, Turkmenistan. But I don't know if in today's current political and economic environment, if as it's been envisioned, that pipeline will happen. Turkmenistan gas is going to go to markets outside of Turkmenistan. The question is where and how. But I think the Caspian gas story in general, the Azeri gas, will definitely make it to European markets, and it will do it on the timeline that they're envisioning. I mean, the pipeline infrastructure to bring that Azeri gas is already being built. Turkey has done a groundbreaking. The groundbreaking for the pipeline in Greece is scheduled for May. So that pipeline is being built, and I think by 2020 you'll see Azeri gas going through Azerbaijan, Georgia, through Turkey, through Greece, Albania under the sea, and into Italy, and you'll see it hitting European markets, which I think is a great development and very important.
Final question of the evening.
It's been a wonderful discussion, so thank you for coming, and thank you for the discussion. The one thing you haven't addressed that I've heard is nuclear energy, and you could make the argument that, if you take a different perspective, that's where the imperative lies in terms of decreasing the carbon emissions. And all the solutions you've mentioned so far have been still using fossil fuels. So where do we stand now with nuclear, and not just in the US, but of course Japan has its own dynamics, and France and Germany have their own way of addressing this, but could somebody talk about where nuclear is going to fit in the future?
Sharon, do you want to say anything?
Well, I mean, it's definitely an important part of the global energy mix, and it will remain so. In the United States, it's a big part of our baseload electricity mix. It doesn't apply for absolutely everything. You're still going to have to figure out what you're going to do with your vehicles, for example, things like that. But I think there are some current concerns that you also have to work out if you're going to increase your nuclear, including proliferation risks. Certainly for the United States, that's a perennial concern. But there's no question that it's part of the answer. It has to be. And for DoD in particular, it's a big part of our answer already, right? Some of our biggest assets that consume the most energy are nuclear. So I guess I think it's a fair question, but implicit in the question is we have a tendency to feel like there's going to be one answer and that we're going to find the thing that solves this problem. And I just don't think it's going to be that way. I think we're going to have a number of different answers. I've heard it referred to as there's no silver bullet, it's silver buckshot. And I think nuclear is part of that solution, but it's not going to be the only solution. And especially when you look at global demand in every place where we're going to have to, a lot of places in the world right now that don't have electricity, that need to be electrified, where nuclear is not going to be the best solution. So I think it's an important part of the solution, but it's not the only answer to what we have to do.
Well, great. Well, please join me in thanking our panelists for the great discussion. And also, this tonight's discussion will be available on the Center's website. It will be available in a few days. You can also subscribe to the Center's podcast series on iTunes, Stitcher, never heard of Stitcher before, SoundCloud, and lots of other platforms. And I also just want to announce 3 upcoming events that will be held here. The Post-Paris International Collaborations on Clean Energy, which will be held next Tuesday, April 19th from 10:30 to 12. Women, Energy, and Economic Empowerment, also next Tuesday, April 19th from 6:30 to 8:30 in the Columbia Club. And the 2016 Columbia Global Energy Summit, which will be held on Wednesday, April 27th to 1 to 5:30 p.m. in the Lowe Memorial Library Rotunda. So again, we hope to see you all soon, and many thanks again for you guys.